Welcome to Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered with Perry Clark. This program looks at mental health from unique perspectives and shows you how to manage your life by finding the knots that help you and stay away from the ones that could be a disadvantage. Now, here is your host, Perry Clark.
Hello all. Welcome back to Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered. I hope you're enjoying your 2024 as we have started in this year. So I want to start with the classic reminder that this podcast is for entertainment and educational purposes only. It does not constitute working with a licensed mental health provider, but if there is one in your area, please seek them out to work on your unique issues. So as we continue this start of 2024, I have the pleasure of introducing you to someone that I had seen. I went to this convention in September of 2023. First time able to go. It's been a long time desire to go, but finally got my ass there. And as we were sort of just taking in all the sights, one particular day, they happened to sit down next to me as they were talking with some other people. And I said, hello. And they said, hello. And then I realized, oh, this is the person I had been watching one of the earlier online adventures, or online seminar talks from Big Bad Con. And at that point, it says, oh, I've wanted to always talk to you. Would you like to be on the podcast? So what I'd love to introduce you all to is our guest, who is Pam Punzalan. Pam Punzalan is a queer Filipina game worker based in Ontario, Canada. She does narrative work, design, editing, and inclusive consultation, sensitivity and cultural, for tabletop role-playing games. Beyond developing personal projects of her own, she has, let's see here, that's Sundu own, which is Sundu, The Second Fight, Navathans End, and an up-and-coming Dagger's Isle supplements for Blades in the Dark. And it was a talk about Dagger's Isle that I had seen that just said, oh, yes, I want to talk with this person. She has been credited with multiple tabletop games, including Dungeons & Dragons, Journey Through the Radiant Citadel, Hunter the Reckoning, Werewolf, The Apocalypse, Thirsty Sword Lesbians, Advanced Swords and Lesbians, Spire, Shadow Operations, just to name a few of the multitude of various tabletop games that they have been a part of. Let's see here. Their work has earned her multiple nominations, including the Innies and the Nebula Award. Similarly, her community work has been recognized by award-winning bodies like the Diana Wynne Jones Award. Prior to doing game design, Pam was pursuing an MA in Literature and Cultural Studies at, I'm not even pronounce the university, but it is in Manila University, where she juggled her teaching responsibilities with academic studies. She moved on to work as a legal compliance officer for a small real estate firm, but continued to organize play-facing tabletop adventures for her queer folks and women in Manila. In addition to this, she was on the floors at the some of the largest esports and gaming convention in the Philippines, doing coverage through a feminist lens. Two of the notable events Pam organized, together with a team of like-minded individuals, looks like LacanaCon, the first queer, feminine-faced tabletop event in Manila, and Session Zero, the first Southeast Asian-facing tabletop con in the industry. In 2019, Pam shifted full-time into game design and following a transformative experience at Big Bad Con in San Francisco. She was one of the POC Programming Committee Scholars, a group that she has served as leadership for ever since. In specific, Pam is in charge of the Southeast Asian delegates, ensuring that more aspiring game workers from the global South meet important industry professionals in tabletop and video gaming. At present, Pam is continuing her community work in an elevating position. She's the executive director of Dames Making Games, a Canadian non-for-profit for marginalized digital artists and game workers. She is also doing her first semester at Sheridan College, teaching a course called Stories, Quests, and Missions. So welcome to Untying Knots. That is a very impressive, and I'm happy to read, bio.
Thank you. It's been a journey to say the least.
Definitely, definitely. I mean, just the number of things that you stepped into, were able to create the first of, are all both impressive and all very much needed. So beyond what I said there, what are other things that helped you get to where you are and bring you to where you are today?
Um, I think it was mostly just persistence because to contextualize for a more American audience, right? Tabletop and gaming in general is very niche in my country. There is a
Mm-hmm.
high basically there is a 1% and then there's everybody else. That's how it
Right.
works there because it is a third world country.
Mm-hmm.
So anything that is a hobby is seen as a luxury, especially
Mm-hmm.
if it's gaming, because gaming is extremely expensive and there is a very real literacy barrier in which most people do not actually speak or read English well. And most
Mm-hmm.
games are unfortunately in English. So there's a whole
Right.
lot of many things, right? And I grew up reading Advanced Dungeons and Dragons and Warhammer more than I read
Mm-hmm.
children's books because of my brothers. So at the time that I was about to enter college, there were no game design courses. So I took the next best thing, which I like doing, which is English literature, because I did want
Mm-hmm.
to teach and I also wanted to write.
Mm-hmm.
And on the side, even as I was in college, I was already trying to set up conventions with friends and do volunteer work at the local anime cons. So I guess
Mm-hmm.
the seed was there this whole time. And Southeast Asian folks did get together to make the Session Zero Con. And that was an interesting flashpoint for many of us because the organizers and I all agreed that in order to participate in that con, you actually have to have games to sell. So a lot of
Mm-hmm.
people who were on the fence about being game designers suddenly felt pressure to actually produce a game so that they
Mm-hmm.
could participate. So upwards of 30 to 50 people came
Oh,
together and brought their games. Yeah, it was great.
that's
And some of those
that's
um
great.
some of those games actually showed up in 2019 when I came to Big Bad Con.
Mm-hmm.
I brought a suitcase full of them and I was just
Mm-hmm.
passing them around to people, selling them when I could, and taking accounts for my people back home. So yeah, it was it's a multi-level question how you get into the industry. uh I think I was also lucky in that my efforts were recognized by key people who
Mm-hmm.
also have the inclination not to pull the ladder up but to lower it down as far as they can,
Mm-hmm.
because since those people were impressed with what I had been trying to do and I was also really putting myself out there, I guess because I felt loved and supported enough to do so, and I really was confident in my own abilities. They
Mm-hmm.
said, "Okay, cool. Well, let's get you your first contracts," and I guess the rest is history. So,
Oh yes, very much on that. I admit, BidBadCon was quite an experience for myself. Finally, being able to go, and I was sitting there with Bridget Jeffries of Symphony Entertainment,
right,
and we're sort of both we're going back and forth. And there was a moment I sort of turned to look at her, and she's sort of staring at the room, and I said, "So it's like, what's going on?" And she says, "This is the first time I've seen this many people of color
right,
in and we were at the dinner. I wasn't able to make the meet and greet, but in this many of people of color at a convention, and that room was 200 of us
right,
sitting there. And this was a conversation we'd had when I first met her, and I interviewed her about the experience of being people of color in the gaming environment as
right,
well.
right. Yeah, it's
And
Oh, sorry.
yeah,
Go ahead.
no, you go right ahead. I'm just happy to listen.
Well, it's interesting because while the convention is far from perfect, the point in my eyes is to get it started, right?
Mm-hmm.
I had a bit of a post con wrap up with a very good friend of mine, and he told me because I was having another moment of deep leadership anxiety, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because with Ajit George stepping down, and he was kind of the head of the POC programming committee, and Sean Nittner also saying, "Hey, I'm going to hang up the towel and pass the baton of BBC
Mm-hmm.
down to another person." I was like, "Well, where? How do we proceed from here? Because obviously this is very important to many people. It might not work for everybody, but it works for enough for it to make a difference in their lives." Uh,
Mm-hmm.
I'm I am not one to make grand accolades. I realize about I am doing this because it's going to change a wide room, right? I feel
Mm-hmm.
like in all of the work I've done on advocacy and consultancy, and other matters. It's the moment you start thinking that you can signpost that you're the main hero and you're going to fix everything is the moment you may have actually failed to actually espouse change. You have to look at the grassroots of things and see how far you can push with as many folks as you have the capacity for, right?
Right.
And for me, I was sharing all of that with my friend, and he told me, well, look at it this way. Big Bad Con is not perfect, but your bar is already up here. You can only go back to that bar or improve. There's no actual room for failure because you cannot fail. That's how good Big Bad Con is now. You're already up here. You're going to be fine. Unless you close shop or somebody does something absolutely catastrophic, you're going to be okay, even if this incoming year is going to be hard. So that was very nice to hear.
Very much so. Well, I think it also goes back to that classic quote that if you live long enough, you stop being the hero and you start being the villain. And especially when you get lost in that power standpoint, or especially the ego standpoint, yeah, you're heading towards your villainy arc as opposed to your hero arc.
And like, what is a hero really, right? My father, for example, is he's very conservative in his thinking. He's a survivor, like my mother, of martial law in the 1980s of the Philippines. And he once told me, what is heroism but getting yourself into a really bad situation on purpose and then being lucky enough to survive? And I was like, that's a very interesting perspective to have, in which his elaboration for that was real heroism, if you even want to call it heroism at all, is somebody who has been constantly watching the ground, constantly looking out for themselves and for their people. And after you've fulfilled your capacity there, then you very carefully and gradually expand your light so that more people can participate. And you can't convince all of them, but you can certainly choose your battles and see who might be willing to stand with you. You can't have somebody who will just like wave distantly in the background and say, good luck, man. You need people who are willing to stick their necks out for you the way that you stick their necks out for them, and have a very sensitive eye towards power dynamics, towards real motivations, and who's honest with you at what times and who isn't. So it's enlightening advice.
Oh, definitely. And I think it's also one of those things too, based off of that we don't really get discussed in the hero narratives.
No.
Or especially and going frowning on Joseph Campbell, but the standpoint of those hero narrative, and even then the hero narratives he talks about is what's been slimmed down for people to easily understand. I was talking to Logan Bose, who, those of you listening, was the one we started off this year with. He was talking about Coyote and Crow and the aspect of just his own studies of Native American storytelling. The idea of the one is not something that exists there.
No.
So how much of even what you just mentioned is so much more of what would be processed in a Native American or even indigenous culture's idea of what a hero is versus, shall we say, this Western European dominant culture idea that they have to be this Luke Skywalker, Batman, Neo from the Matrix, whatever it is.
Right. It's interesting too, because I think a hero narrative later bled into the very American exceptionalist idea, right? Of, I am one person raging against the man being whatever you choose, right? But at the end of the day, it still leads back to an uncomfortable reality that the majority of the world's cultures don't actually understand, comprehend, and refuse to believe in, that you're the main character of your own story. The essence of a true leader is someone who is not the main character of their own story, right? No. They've chosen other things. They know how to manage themselves. They have an eye for community, right? I have a very good friend, Liam Stevens. He's Maori. And he was explaining how in their own culture, this sense of one person just doesn't exist. You're not one person. You're never one person. You are your ancestors. You are your home. You are your community, and all of the communities connected to yourself. You're not a person. You are a group. You're like many groups in one body. And to pay homage to that is important, right? And in the Philippines also, we have a very funny position of being 5 times colonized, basically. So there's a lot of push and pull between, I guess, our more Americanized sensibilities and some influence from the Spanish, depending on where you're from, and also our own roots, respectively, because we were never really a country until the colonizers came in.
Right, and
We
they
were a
group
whole
all the
bunch of,
isles.
right, like we were just a whole bunch of, like, I can't even say kingdoms because that word is not accurate, but communes, I guess, or ethnic groups that all did their own thing and were happy to come together when they needed to, but otherwise we respect each other in our diversity and differences. So it's the exceptionalism is something that I always have deep issues with because it bleeds into, of course, gaming spaces in which I have gotten very interesting commentary ever since 2019 of how because I aspire to actually do full-time things in games, and I am fine 100%. If WotC hired me today, I'd be like, sure, hell yeah, how much and where do I go? Right. I've had many fiery fighters, I guess, tell me I'm selling out. And I'm like, that's a funny thing to say when the reality is I am choosing to be stable for myself because I cannot help any of you if I'm not stable for me. And I had no illusions going into this industry. That was another thing that wasn't a very good culture fit initially for me with tabletop, in which I've noticed that Americanized spaces tend to insist that you must all be friends somehow. But I'm very, no, we don't actually. You tell me if you want friendship, and then let's work that out and see if we're compatible. But business is business, and what I say as business Pam is different from what designer Pam says and what actual Pam says, where she has her own life with her own concerns, a fiance she loves very much, that she wants to migrate here 100%. Right? Parents said I need to take care of in the next 20 years. All of those things inform my decisions, and I try to do right by them. I don't pretend to be saving game design. I don't pretend that any discourse, quote unquote, that I participate in is for some higher cause. I take gumption with many young designers who go in saying, I'm going to revolutionize games with my game design. And I'm like, it's nice of you to think that you are, but please don't tell me that you're doing this for me, because any benefit to you doesn't mean that you're actually benefiting me. Right? Like, don't pretend that you're going to change games. Just be honest with me about your intentions. If you want to change games, let's talk, right? But if you're really just there because you want clout, or you want fame, or you want to feel good about yourself, or you want money, just be upfront about it. I don't understand why we have to add a moral ascendancy to our game designer narratives.
That probably still has its aspects into the Western dominated story aspects of it, because I think also from what I deal with in the therapied environment, which is its own similarity, is one of the things I often talk about with clients is what is the role that you're playing at any particular time, which is similar to what you're saying about communities.
Yeah.
You're not playing the same role 24/7. You're multiple faces, from being someone's child to being someone's parent to being someone's friend, or vice versa. And all of those come with different responsibilities that, sometimes you got to tell somebody they're being an ass. Sometimes you got to basically make sure that this person's ego is very well taken care of. And especially when you're dealing with kids whose emotional selves are still building.
Yeah.
Those are not all the same demands that you need to be kicking in a door with.
Yeah, it's I also feel like there's very colonialist perspective that folks aren't exactly cognizant of, because there's a cry for change, is how I might be able to put it, right, since 2019, that we need to make more tables, we need more people of color in the room, we need to be a unified front, as many people say. But you cannot be a unified front. You should not be a unified front. You need to be able to have hard conversations with each other. You have to recognize each other's differences and positionalities and perspectives. The global South reality will never be the POC reality in America,
Mm-hmm.
we can find common ground and fight along those things and also agree to some very simple principles, right? But I cannot fight the battles of my diasporic brothers and sisters, in which they also cannot exactly fight for whatever's happening back in my home.
Mm-hmm.
And I think honestly that there's some beauty in that. People need to be less afraid of this because I think it's going to make everybody a lot more honest in
Mm-hmm.
that, let us have our communities and you will have yours. We will talk and share and break bread. But
Mm-hmm.
making more tables is better than making one table and insisting that everybody sits on it with particular codified behavior and things that they should say and it's my way or the highway behavior, because I've seen that a lot in tabletop across the years. I'm not like I'm still baby in the eyes of a lot of folks who've been doing game design for 10 to 20 years, but I still got something to say about that, since a lot of those 10 to 20 year game designers are American. They have no sense of what it's like for us.
Oh, I know exactly what you mean. And when I was talking to Logan and about the game that I played while I was there in Coyote Crow, they're just as he put it, we ended up having his favorite solution to this particular story we played, and ultimately, we did not solve this. We solved it by not actually having to fight.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the bulk of the party were fighters. I wasn't playing a fighter character, but we found a solution that still gave the fighter something to do, but they actually didn't have to fight.
Yeah.
And so many of the notions around a tabletop game is, oh yeah, sooner or later you got to fight.
Yeah. Yeah. Violence is an answer. Yeah.
Exactly.
And just that I actually have a long project I've been thinking of, like a extended article on a mediation and the use of violence in tabletop, right? Because with video games is a constant discourse, and rightfully so, because pretty much every video game has some kind of combat mechanic in it, and it's almost like video games equals violence, and that's that, right? And there's a wider conversation with respect to video games and how many games are actually funded by the same people who are committing genocide in Palestine, et cetera, right? Like if you follow the money, you ain't gonna like what you see, right? With video games, right? But that presupposes that must it really be necessary for tabletop, right? Because I had a client who was recently who was saying a lot of nice things about how D&D is a global culture, and I had to go like, I'm going to stop you right there. That is factually, historically inaccurate for the following reasons. Now, my country is all D&D, yes, but many other countries I've spoken to are not. So perhaps the more correct thing to say about this game is that it is a culture that is very prominent in English-speaking markets around the world and to America. Let's not assume that America determines everything. That's part of the problem, that we keep presuming that the country does, right? Because even Canada has its own positionality, in which Canada and Canadian creators, especially if they're marginalized, tend to be forgotten or lumped into the American dream of games, where that's not accurate at all. And that's something I'm discovering even more now that I'm engaging with game workers and digital artists here. So
yeah, which adds that aspect of the whole premise of dealing with the dominant culture and what we're colliding against, which is what I really loved when I was listening to your talk about the Dagger Isles and the differences between the relationships with spirits that were being worked on in Dagger Isles versus Blades in the Dark, which was in a very classic Roman Euro centric empire.
Yeah. John Harper has done fantastic work, and I deeply respect him. And that's part of why I felt this need to create a Dagger Isles is very Southeast Asian facing. Because on the other hand, many people love the system, but I've got the same comment over and over again from many of my POC peers, both Global South and diasporic, where they were saying, I could not play it because the setting does not make sense to me. So I just play Forge in the Dark games, or I take Blades and put it in my own city. And I was like, there's something there, right? And then when some people were also saying Dagger Isles, what was fascinating to me was that there were three principal responses when people looked at the very bare bones lore of Dagger Isles. Some people said it was Southeast Asia. Some people said it was Africa. Some people said it was South America. Now, I am not African or Black, nor am I South American, but I'm absolutely Southeast Asian. So I said, okay, let's make a Southeast Asian Dagger Isles because that's near and dear to my heart. I already had some source material for my own game, so let's see how it goes. I made the pitch, and Sean and John were like, oh, let's do it. And I'm like, okay, it's happening,
But no, but it very much gets into the standpoint of as global majority, yes, indigenous is the premise of why and how we're functioning doesn't match this other world.
Yeah. Yeah.
So whether you feel you're not, you're seeing that similarities because like, no, there's an aspect of what community means, what it means for our mutual survival as opposed to individual survival.
Yeah. And I think it's becoming harder, right? Because many people are now, especially in light of Israel and Palestine, and folks reminding people about Congo and Sudan, that actually everybody in some form or fashion is complicit. That is the nature of the violent, oppressive systems that have created many of our creature comforts and the things that we literally need to survive. There is no such thing anymore as I can't do anything. You can. Now, you don't always have to be doing something 24/7. You can be doing something to help. There are ways to be better. There are ways to minimize harm. We're not in a position anymore where you are innocent and harmless. You are doing harm by breathing. That is something that everybody, and I implore this upon anyone who asks me these hard questions, like, no, you accept your accountability for this, that you are not a harmless person. You are not innocent, unfortunately. Were you unaware? 100%. But now that you are aware, do the math. Right? Figure out how to mitigate and minimize and transform rather than shirk responsibility and deny accountability and pretend that you can just go back to sleep like nothing happened. Right. It's a lot. I know that some folks online, for example, especially in our game circles, were very like, if you're silent about Palestine, you're a terrible human being. And my only counter to that was, what if those people actually are trying to immigrate right now and their country will literally deny their visa if they see anything on social media? Because I can think of rather, because I don't want to talk for them, right? I can think of at least 10 to 20 people in my direct circle who are exactly in that position, right? And then on my end, I'm like, it's ridiculous to me that these American people who are morally grandstanding don't even bother wikiing my country and speaking about my issues, right? It's like, don't make this a game, man, because you're going to lose. Okay. Lots of interesting things happening in game design perpetually.
Well, it's also that reflection of how one would say how game theory, which is one, if we want to talk about spycraft and all of that, is really talking about how people are motivated. And that same motivation, especially when I deal with it in mental health, is how have the beliefs about these motivations for safety perpetuated mental health problems that
That's right.
could have been addressed in other ways. Also, how much is that standpoint of someone who is, I'm going to say the standpoint of unhealthy mental in the community, also poisoning the rest of the community? Not that you want to excise them, but it means that there has to be a different way of operating with them, and they have to understand there's a different way they have to operate with it too.
Right, exactly.
And that's a big one with just dealing with couples.
Yeah, it's hard, especially since culturally neurodivergence and mental health and disability and accessibility all have different definitions and different things attached to it according to where you are. Like mental health in the Philippines is basically nobody talks about it, right? And the free resources are few and far between. And there's also a dangerously Catholic perspective to many therapists where they will, for example, force people to always think about forgiveness and God and bring God into their relationship. And I'm like, I'm queer and the Catholic Church hates me. So I really don't need God. And I've proven that to myself years and years in that God has done nothing for me. Has the universe done many things for me? Absolutely. Do I believe that there's something out there? Possibly, right? I'm not going to shake its tree, right? I don't know what it is, but it's certainly not this Catholic abstract God that makes me want to hate myself for somehow failing an impossible standard. That's done nothing for me, you know? And again, mental health in the Philippines is just, I mean, if you're, it's always you're sane or you're crazy. That's how they deal with it. And if you're crazy, you're broken. And if you're broken, go pray. And I'm like, what? You know?
Right.
It's tricky stuff.
When the path to healing is something a little more complex, when it requires, again, changing some of these relationships, because it's been perpetuated at the standpoint of community, this communal idea may not actually be working. It may be functioned at this particular moment in time, depending on those circumstances, but it does not function through the rest of the time. And even that standpoint of, and I say this with full respect to Black women, the idea of intersectionality of how many different roles, how many different communities we dance in. And the same thing comes with tabletop and just a sense of games. Just as you were talking about with the idea of D&D being the global majority. No, from what I've understand in Japan, I think China, Call of Cthulhu is the big one.
And their own games. Yeah. The, what do they call it in China? The murder mystery. They have entire swaths of land of simulated games with no homage to D&D whatsoever. Right. Like, it's just, you cannot, like, please don't be a colonizer is usually what I end up having to write in many different forms to a lot of people who want to do a thing, right? It's such a complex issue to unpack because a lot of it also involves, it's almost like a poker game. That's how I see it, right? They got their cards and I've got mine, and I need to read their subtle cues in order to figure out what's really going on behind the hood, because it's rare, I'll tell you, that a client is actively trying to do harm. They're really not, is the thing. So then you have to do the very careful threading of the needles, because you want this person to keep designing, but you want them to keep designing correctly. You want them to acknowledge that actually that story is not yours. And if you insist on making it, you must include more people into your collectivist activity of making a game, right? Like with Dagger Isles, people have asked me, why did you bring so many people on board? You're the lead designer. You could have written all of this. And I said, actually, no. I'm Southeast Asian, but I'm not from Singapore. I'm not Thai. I'm not from Vietnam. I'm not Thai. I can't write those stories, and they cannot write mine. So I need their voices to make my project happen, because it's not my project. When I say my project now, I mean our project, because Dagger Isles would not exist without the whole team, right? So it's I respect designers who want to try to dwell in their own fantastic worlds and make their baby, but sometimes it's not actually your baby, man.
Especially because there's going to be blind spots.
Yeah,
exactly. People can see the blind spots that you can't.
Yeah.
Just think about driving. Can you always be looking over your left shoulder or your right shoulder when you also need to be aware of that car that's in front of you? No.
Yeah. It's tricky, especially with there are deep-seated roots on why white cultures are fascinated by particular other cultures. And part of those deep-seated roots is the idea of conquest and consumption. If you are not somebody who is actively trying to colonize a space with your own ideas and make it comfortable for you, you are somebody who wants to put these things in a pretty menagerie and pick whatever you want at your leisure. That is, I'm not going to say violence and harm, but that's certainly extremely uncomfortable and needs to be unpacked, you know?
Oh, yes. I think that's a beautiful place for us to take a break and let folks ponder this during the break. So, I'm Perry Clark, licensed marriage and family therapist here on Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered with Pam Punzalan, game designer, CEO, and storyteller. So we'll be back shortly, folks, and stay tuned.
Want to see what Voice America is up to behind the scenes? Follow us on TikTok at Voice America Talk Radio.
Our lives and the world around us can get messy and frustrating. Untangle and Grow Counseling's focus is to untangle that mess and make sense of it so you have a good foundation to build and grow from. Visit us on the web at untangleandgrowcounseling.com. Perry Clark offers individual psychotherapy, couples and family therapy, and adolescence therapy from a variety of coping materials and resources. Visit untangleandgrowcounseling.com for more information.
Where can you listen to some of the world's top life coaches ready to dish out success tips and entrepreneurial guidance? The Voice America Empowerment Channel will do just that. Whether it's personal growth, building a better business, or inspirational life stories, make it a daily habit to tune into our programs. From weight loss and personal branding to law of attraction and increased happiness, you'll find it every day at VoiceAmericaEmpowerment.com. The Voice America Empowerment Channel. It's your world. Motivate, change, succeed.
You are listening to Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered. If you have a question or comment about our podcast, send an email to pclark@untyingknotspodcast.com. That's pclark@untyingknotspodcast.com. And now, back to the program.
Hello all, welcome back to Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered. I'm Perry Clark, licensed marriage and family therapist, here with Pam Punzalan. Always screw up names. You want to say it for
Punzalan. Punzalan.
Okay.
Yeah.
I swear, there's not an episode that I do not screw up somebody's name, despite all my efforts. Game designer, writer, CEO. And on that point of CEO, tell us a bit more about what the company you're CEO of there in Canada.
So it's a not-for-profit. It's and yeah, CEO is still pretty accurate since that's executive direction. And it was interesting because it was very serendipitous. It's my very first job in Canada because I literally just migrated last year. And a friend of mine who's in my city or close to it was like, Pam, you need to apply to this job. And I said, this job seems to require this little thing that I don't have, which is Canadian context. The last time I was living in Canada, I was a baby. And then I only stayed until I was 10. Then we moved back to Manila and then I came here. So I got nothing for you. And they said, no, do it anyway. The last thing that'll happen to you is you'll fail. And that just means that you're back to the same point you were at. And I'm like, you know what? Fair. So I ended up applying. They ended up taking me. And it's been a very interesting ride ever since. So Dames Making Games is actually quite old. Since 2012. They started out as a grassroots organization sort of thing where they were trying to get game designers together, specifically women. The queer wasn't really in the equation yet. So it was for femme presenting folks who wanted to talk about game design, who wanted to get jobs in industry support. It sort of exploded with government grants and their own internal efforts, in which now we try to create accelerator programs for studios run by marginalized developers. So we're always looking for partnerships, donations, and etc., so that we can make sure that studios full of people who want to tell their own stories make games that matter. So that's the basic spiel about DMG. We're in a bit of a slowdown at this year because there's been a lot of internal transition and et cetera, but we're hoping that the anxieties and the troubles will vanish by now and get a little better. So,
well, speaking and naming them do help. because there's also, and I say this also not just because I'm a mental health provider, but in that standpoint of these things are sitting here with so many people probably most likely thinking about it and saying it and keeping it within themselves without realizing that the persons next to them on either side are also dealing with it. And that normalization, that anxiety exists. Anxiety is going to happen. Actually, the person who does not feel anxiety, that's a problem.
That's true.
Yeah, because fundamentally, the person who does not feel anxiety is not connected to their emotions. And they will make decisions that can, as we've seen, harm people.
Yeah. It's there's a lot of good things happening in games, making games now that, well, the pandemic hit us very hard apparently before I even entered, in which DMG had grown used to in-person events and a physicality in their connections. So when the pandemic happened on a practical level, many of them actually moved out of the Ontario area. And then on another level, there was digital fatigue. You know, everybody's suddenly on Discord and every other platform. You get tired of looking, so you don't really engage a lot in many spaces that you are a part of nominally. But now that things are easing up, now I have thoughts about that. But regardless of my wishes, right? It's easing up because pandemic is gone or fading, like whatever, man. But sure, DMD is stepping up in-person events with all of the COVID precautions in place, while we're also going a little bit hybrid and making sure that we have our programs online. Like we are currently running a thing called Mayhem, where designers can basically do a boot camp on how to do game design. So they present their concepts and we give them mentors who host talks that are all on Twitch. So I think DMG has helped a lot of people, and I'm glad to be part of their journey so far. I'm moving into my second year with them, and let's just see how it goes, even with all of our troubles, financial or otherwise.
Well, I think it comes with just doing not so much games, but just doing business in the way the world is right now. Going back to that, either you're colonizing or you're putting it on for show.
Yeah, definitely. It's we want to be a bridge. And I think this goes back to another deep thing that I believe in strongly. One of the things that is constantly robbed of marginalized people in game spaces and in wider industries is the privilege of failure. You must be perfect. You need to
succeed,
right? You must be perfect or you're the enemy, even to your own. But the thing is, many industries, and games especially, require failure. Your job as a not-for-profit, and this is what I believe now that of course I'm self-talking myself, right? But the job of an advocate or the job of somebody actively engaged in not-for-profit structures is to make room for that failure and to provide support. You're not expecting them to fail, but you know that it is a reality. And the last thing these people need is someone else questioning their failures and going, well, maybe it's because you weren't good enough, with the subtext of being you weren't white enough or you weren't cishet enough, right?
Or you weren't God-fearing enough.
Exactly, right? Like it's ridiculous. The number of barriers and the number of expectations that communities, white or otherwise, place upon marginalized people. We need to fuck up, and we need to be allowed to do that. We need to learn to keep ourselves accountable. We also need to recognize our differences, but you've already heard me go off on many spiels on that. So
yeah. Well, also, and I think that one of the other big ones there you just said about accountability. And it's something I noticed, especially again from the mental health side of it. Accountability has basically been weaponized. It's become punitive, as opposed to considering it as something that is based in love and that care that, you're going to fail. This accountability means we've got to recognize these problems. So again, we don't have the biohazard girl sitting in the closet from all that dirty laundry.
Yeah, exactly.
That's beautiful, and I'm glad to be. I would definitely be putting notes about DMG in the notes here. So if you want to basically find out more, definitely check the show notes. And you'll be able to see them there.
Much appreciated, especially if you're in Canadian and if you're Canadian or in Canada. That's our current premise. We are trying to expand such that we will become a regional operation versus versus Toronto based, because that's really where DMG started. Many of our members are again outside. We have many members in Montreal and also in British Columbia in particular, and a couple in Nova Scotia. So we're trying hard, but it's a group push. So
No doubt there. So we talked a bit about the nonprofit and being POC dealing with gaming, but I'm also curious, how is it showing up with queer gaming as well?
So I've known I was queer, and of course you kind of have to start with yourself, right? Whenever you talk about queerness. I've known I was queer since I was 15. And queerness in itself, as I have come to realize, is a decision that you constantly make, while it is also who you are inexplicably and unapologetically, right?
Yourself.
Right. Like you can't, it's something that grows and expands and transforms and also at times recedes and minimizes itself, right? And undoubtedly, no matter what you do, because you're queer, your games will be queer. Now, what flavor of queer, what inclination of queer, whether it is a queerness that is genuine and earnest, or it is a queerness that you are clinging to because it just makes a lot more sense at this time than anything else, it is queer, right? And I know that academically people have defined queerness not quite bolted in as sexuality, which is interesting. It's more of something that is an other, that is different, that is radical and strange, right? And queerness also has several levels to it. So that's like the one fact, right? If you're a queer designer, your games are queer. That's where I will fight people who say otherwise, right? But on the other hand, there are also intersections to queerness in which my queer reality may never be yours. And then there are also people who, there's a very white strain of queerness that I cannot abide by as well, in which it's hard to like really describe it, but I can give examples of how white queerness dominates the conversation in a very harmful way when it comes, especially in game design, or even just talking to other human beings, in which it's hard for me to talk about the specificity of my queer issues when I get a lot of American well-intended friends saying, well, why don't you just fight your mom and dad when they don't agree with what you're saying? And I'm like, you understand, right, that in Philippine culture, that is a huge ass no, because then I'll literally have nowhere to go. And on top of that, people I don't know will all know that I'm gay. And then they're going to think I hate God and that I need God and that they should probably send me to conversion therapy, right? Like it's a whole lot of, you must understand that even with all the problems that first world countries have, the fact that your country in some areas recognizes that you are actually human is very different from my country, where it is enshrined in our marriage law that marriage is only possible between man and woman. There is no common law. We don't even have divorce. And that's for straight people. We're not even seen as human. We don't even have a proper Magna Carta or a Bill of Rights. We only have a awareness bill, and even that's being fought, right? That informs more than you'll ever know for any Filipino queer designer. So it's very interesting engaging with different queer folks from all around the world and hearing their stories, and also understanding how, even as we try to struggle and be different and be authentic to ourselves, the unique systems in which we come from inform both our trauma responses and also inform how we engage with other people, and also how we try to inform ourselves and take care of ourselves, right? So it's a whole new bag, right?
So you open up that aspect of our which very much hits with mental health, is that aspect of trauma gaming.
Yeah.
How much of the games that have been built around, shall we say, continuing to perpetuate trauma as opposed to healing trauma.
Yeah, exactly. Like when I first started designing, I noticed that a lot of people had not really talked about a concept that I personally like to call Asian acceptance.
Mm-hmm.
I've literally made it a game. It is literally called Asian acceptance, and it uses the mechanics of Dread, that
Mm-hmm.
tower game where you have to
Yep.
pull blocks and stuff, right?
Yep.
Um, in my game, that tower is your heart. And each session of Asian acceptance is a day in the life of you being a person in the closet in an Asian context. And then all the little microaggressions that make you pull out parts of your heart, or all of the things that make you put another block in properly in order to survive, the little microaggressions, the side comments, the burden of expectation, your own feelings and your own monstrosities, and the own sacred selves that you have, and the things that you must render profane. That's all there in that heart of yours. That's how I describe being in the closet. It was inspired by the fact that my father, and this is prior to me actually coming out and having a whole thing with my parents where I didn't talk to them for 2 years, kind of level, right? Prior to that, I guess my dad had the suspicion that I might be gay because I was on the phone with him when he was in Canada trying to look for the house that we're living in now here. And he basically said, I want to make sure that you have a future with your spouse, whoever he or she may be. And I was like, we've never talked about this. So were you just saying that you know that I might be and you're okay with it? It was just this whole Asian thing of like, how do you negotiate from here, right? And that was when my best friend in the world, right? Yeah. Like my best friend in the world told me, well, Pam, you were just a recipient of Asian acceptance. He knows that there's a reality, but he doesn't want to talk about it yet. But he's saying that there's an elephant in the room and he may be okay with it. the number of levels. Right?
Oh yeah. But even just what you said about using Dread and the Jenga Tower, or well, popular trademark name Jenga, but the block tower.
Yeah.
That is just beautiful. I mean, I can just now think about it, it's like, oh, I could just think about the number of therapists that would love to probably use this in our therapy practices, especially most of the geek therapists out there, that this would be a beautiful game to be played. I mean, obviously it's a game, but still just what it means to have that perspective shift and to allow for that perspective shift that's necessary for good therapy to happen. Oh, it makes me Jones.
I'm hoping to republish it at one point because it only got a digital release. So in this year, I plan on approaching a publisher that did right by my partner with their game, and I'm like, hey, maybe you want to try to get that one. So
please let me know about it, and when you're ready to publish it, well, let's do an episode because I can target this so much towards the geek therapist community who this would be an ideal one, even for group work.
Yeah, another game I'm quite proud of, although it's written as queer. That's my example of a queer game, right? It's called Our Armistice. That also has a digital only release. And it is about a lover waiting for their hero to come home from war. So the whole thing is just an exercise of one of you playing the hero and one of you playing the lover. And the whole, like the meta space of the game is the hero walking home. But what's actually happening in the game is both of you are thinking about the last conversation you had, the nature of the war, and what it might be like now that everything is over and you must return to your heart. That's the whole exercise. Some people played it online and they were like, this hits hard. And I'm like, well, it should, because that's the whole thing, right? Nobody talks about the intimacy in the wake of something terrible that you survived from. Right. It's very classic in fantasy, right? If hero kills God, comes home, the end. You never see the home scene. You
never see what happens after. I mean, oh yeah, that's one big one I especially talk about with people, especially the ones who are dealing with relationship aspects, and they're saying like, oh, I want the happily ever after. It's like, really? Do you realize what that's what happened when the roof leaks? What happened when the bills due? What happens when little Billy gets bullied at school?
Yeah.
That's part of having happily ever after.
Yep. Yeah.
And how much we've sort of gotten the sanitized story about that, because you cannot go off to war and not be changed by.
Yeah, like my parents, even with my complications with them, I love them very much, and I know that they love me, and they are trying their best to accept this queer thing, right? And they're doing pretty well for a 70-plus-year-old baby boomer generation, right? They've been married for 50 years, man. 50 years. And it's just, wow. And then when people ask them, how did they do it? My mom and my dad will always say the same thing. We did it together. There was no I and you. There was only we. And then we determined the separate I's and how they fit, how they break apart, how we can compromise. And sacrifices had to happen, but they were always informed by love. Because that's another thing that my mom and my dad like to say, that there's a difference between saying something, giving advice, and thinking of yourself, or giving advice and thinking of the other person while you're thinking of yourself. There's a very key difference there. And that's how the relationship has survived. Through 2 to 3 migrations, through near financial ruin several times, through seeing, by popping out 6 kids, an only daughter who ended up gay, and having a myriad of neurodivergent issues among their children that they're still also reckoning with, because they don't actually really believe in the mental health thing. You know, it's a lot. And yet seeing them, because they very recently celebrated their 50th golden wedding anniversary, like literally last week, and seeing them continue to sing at each other and also have their cute little couple arguments. Like my father scolded my dad, and my mom scolded my dad again for hiding the food, because he has that little idiosyncrasy of, like, if he sees food out, he puts it away. But the thing with my family is we are toddlers. If we don't see the food, we forget about it. Right. So my mom hit my dad on the arm and said, 50 years and you're still doing that. And they both had a good laugh about it. You know?
Well, I think there also comes at the example of they're living the example of accountability through love.
Yeah.
As a form of love, not as a form of punishment.
Yeah, exactly. It's great. Like, they have become my model for an ideal relationship, while knowing full well that they are human and they have their flaws. I don't need them to be perfect. I need them to be human. And they have been exemplary human beings. Like, when I look at them, and when I have looked at them, because now I'm very happily committed to one person, but when I was searching for my own partner, I always found myself thinking, can they even match the fingernail of what my dad or mom do in their relationship? If the answer was no, I was just like, I'm not fucking interested. You know? Literally a gold standard.
Yeah. And that's something we all process. Well, I have enjoyed this chat immensely.
I'm happy. I'd be happy to come back.
Oh, I'm glad to hear it. Like I said, I want to talk more about this game. I want to help promote it as much as possible, because believe me, the therapist market is a place that needs something like this immensely. So where can people find you? Where can they find any of the other games that you want to be able to start people down the road on, and contact you?
So I have a card that's a CARRD.co. That's usually how people get in contact for business. There is my email as well. Just reach out to me if you need any editing, etc., consultancy. I'm looking for entry-level video game writing, so if you're willing to give me a shot, absolutely. I am primarily, and unfortunately, on Twitter. I am more happily on Blue Sky, and I do have a Substack that I occasionally post articles on. I do not pressure myself into posting monthly. So if you're looking for a monthly drop of wisdom, you're not going to get it. But if you're looking for a gold nugget every now and then when Pam realizes that she has words for a thing, then sure, sign up. So that's usually me. I'm the dovetailer everywhere. And if not, you'll see Pam Punzalan. So there's that.
All right. I'll try to make sure as many of those notes are in the show notes as possible. So thank you again for being here and having this chat with me.
Thank you for having me. It was lovely.
Perfect. So this has been Perry Clark, a licensed marriage and family therapist on Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered. Here with, I'm going to have you say your name so I don't screw it up again.
Here with Pam Punzalan.
Game designer, CEO, story writer, So welcome to 2024, folks. We've got more coming down the pipeline. Hopefully more we'll be talking about this game in the future. And stay tuned, and thank you for being here.
Thank you for tuning in for Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered. Be sure to join your host, Perry Clark, for another episode on the podcast coming soon on the Voice America Empowerment Channel.